In the mid-1970s, food was first reduced to a set of numbers and charts. It entered daily life through official guidelines and package labels. The effects of this new framework did not become apparent for years. It was part of a larger, quieter shift in how everything was measured. The idea was simple. Food could be reduced to numbers: calories in, calories out, fat grams, carbohydrate counts, protein percentages. The complexity of how humans had eaten for thousands of years, seasonally, culturally, intuitively, was flattened into charts. And those charts became policy. They became what doctors handed to patients, what schools used to design lunch programs, what magazines published as truth. At the time, this was considered normal. The shift happened gradually, first in institutional settings. Hospitals began serving meals designed around caloric targets rather than traditional food combinations. School cafeterias started calculating lunch trays by macronutrient ratios. The language changed too. Food stopped being described by what it was, butter, eggs, meat, vegetables, and started being described by what it contained: saturated fat, cholesterol, simple carbohydrates. The food itself became secondary to its nutritional breakdown. This reframing didn't happen in isolation. It was reinforced constantly. Nutritional labels appeared on packaging. Government pamphlets explained the new guidelines. Entire industries reorganized around these metrics. Food companies reformulated products to meet the standards: lower fat, higher fiber, fortified with vitamins. The market responded exactly as it was designed to. Most people didn't question it. Why would they? It came from officials. It was printed in newspapers. It was taught in schools. It had the weight of scientific authority behind it. And for the average person trying to feed their family, trying to stay healthy, trying to do the right thing, these guidelines seemed like clarity in a confusing world. It blended into everyday life. But what those guidelines didn't account for, what they couldn't account for given the framework they operated within, was context. They didn't measure what happened when food was stripped of fat and replaced with sugar to maintain palatability. They didn't track what occurred when people were told to eat less of certain things, but given no meaningful guidance on what to eat more of, beyond vague encouragement toward whole grains that were often just as processed as what they replaced. They didn't consider hunger itself, not as a biological signal, but as a force that would push back against restriction. The guidelines assumed willpower. They assumed people could simply eat less, move more, and the numbers would balance. They didn't account for what happens when the body is chronically underfed on nutrients while being overfed on calories. When satiety signals stop functioning properly because the food being consumed doesn't trigger them the way whole foods do. This wasn't discussed openly. The focus remained on individual compliance. If the guidelines weren't working, the assumption was that people weren't following them correctly, not that the guidelines themselves might be incomplete, not that reducing food to numbers might strip out information the body actually uses to regulate itself, not that decades of traditional eating patterns might have contained wisdom that couldn't be captured in a macronutrient ratio. And so the system doubled down. More detailed charts, more specific recommendations, more products engineered to meet the technical requirements while drifting further from anything that resembled food as it had existed before. Low-fat yogurt sweetened with corn syrup, whole grain bread with a dozen additives to simulate the texture of white bread, margarine promoted as a healthy alternative to butter, despite being a completely novel substance the human body had never encountered before in evolutionary history. It seemed too small to matter back then. But the effects didn't appear immediately. That's not how these things work. A single meal engineered to meet nutritional guidelines doesn't damage anyone. A week of eating that way doesn't either. The impact is cumulative. It's in the slow drift of baseline expectations, the recalibration of taste, the gradual dependence on foods that require constant eating to feel satisfied because they never quite deliver satiety. The real impact appeared years later. By the 1990s, patterns were visible, not just in population-level statistics, though those were stark, but in daily experience, in how people related to food. The constant calculations, the guilt around eating, the sense that food was something to be managed rather than enjoyed. The rise of entirely new categories, diet foods, health foods, functional foods, that required their own aisles in supermarkets. And underneath it all, a growing disconnect. People were eating carefully than ever, following guidelines more precisely than ever, and yet something felt wrong. Energy levels didn't stabilize. Weight didn't respond the way the charts said it should. Hunger didn't disappear just because the right number of calories had been consumed. By the time consequences were visible, habits were already set. An entire generation had grown up eating this way. They'd learned in school that fat was dangerous, that calories were the primary concern, that willpower was the solution. They'd watched their parents try diet after diet based on these same principles. They'd internalized the idea that eating was supposed to be difficult, that the body couldn't be trusted, that constant vigilance was necessary. The food environment had changed too. What had been occasional products in the 1970s, highly processed foods engineered to specific nutritional profiles, had become the default. Entire meals could be assembled from packages, each one labeled with precise nutritional information, each one technically meeting guidelines, and yet none of them resembling what humans had eaten for most of history. This wasn't an accident. The system had been designed for scale, for efficiency, for standardization. You can't mass-produce traditional food culture. You can't put regional cooking wisdom on a nutritional label. You can't translate "eat what your grandmother ate" into federal policy. So the system chose what could be measured, what could be controlled, what could be manufactured consistently. The framework itself determined the outcome. And that framework was never neutral. It emerged from specific institutional pressures, the need for universal guidelines that could apply across a diverse population, the influence of agricultural industries with products to sell, the genuine belief among many policymakers that science had advanced beyond traditional approaches to eating, the assumption that human behavior could be engineered through the right combination of information and incentives. But human bodies don't operate like machines with input and output valves. They're responsive systems shaped by millions of years of evolution, calibrated to food in forms that trigger specific biological responses. When that food is fundamentally altered, stripped of nutrients, recombined in novel ways, sweetened and salted and textured to override natural satiety signals, the body's regulatory systems begin to malfunction. Not immediately, not obviously, but persistently. The guidelines didn't create this situation alone, but they provided the framework that made it acceptable, that made it scientific, that shifted responsibility entirely onto individuals, while the food supply transformed around them in ways they had no control over and often no awareness of. Most people were just trying to follow the rules. They were doing exactly what they'd been told would keep them healthy, counting calories, reducing fat, checking labels, choosing products marketed as nutritious. And when it didn't work, when their health didn't improve the way they'd been promised, they blamed themselves. Not the guidelines, not the system that had engineered those guidelines, themselves. That's what made it sustainable. The system had built in a mechanism to deflect accountability. Any failure could be attributed to individual non-compliance, never to structural flaws. If someone gained weight while eating low-fat foods, they must have been eating too much. If someone felt constantly hungry on a calorie-restricted diet, they needed more willpower. If someone's health markers worsened despite following all the recommendations, they must have been doing something wrong. The possibility that the recommendations themselves were incomplete, that they'd stripped essential context from food, that they'd ignored signals the body uses to regulate itself, that they'd enabled an industrial transformation of the food supply with unpredictable long-term consequences, that possibility wasn't seriously considered, not in mainstream guidance, not in the programs and policies that shaped what millions of people ate every day. And so it continued, decade after decade. The guidelines were updated, refined, made more specific, but the core framework remained: food as numbers, health as calculation, the body as a problem to be managed through restriction and willpower. Meanwhile, the products multiplied. More low-fat options, more low-calorie options, more foods engineered to meet technical nutritional standards while maximizing palatability, shelf stability, and profit margins. The entire infrastructure of modern eating, from grocery stores to restaurants to school cafeterias, organized itself around this framework. People adapted because they had no choice. This was the food environment they lived in. These were the guidelines their doctors gave them. This was what was available, what was affordable, what was normalized. And for many, it worked well enough, or seemed to, until it didn't. The long-term cost wasn't measured. Not in the initial studies, not in the policy decisions, not in the triumphant announcements about scientific progress in nutrition. The cost appeared later, diffusely, in ways that were hard to connect back to specific causes. In the epidemic of metabolic dysfunction, in the normalization of constant dieting, in the alienation from food itself, from the simple act of eating without calculation or guilt. Some of that cost is still being paid by people who spent their whole lives following rules that didn't account for how bodies actually work, by children who learned that food is dangerous, that hunger can't be trusted, that eating requires constant monitoring, by communities whose traditional food cultures were dismissed as unscientific, replaced with guidelines that ignored everything those cultures had learned through generations of trial and error. The system that produced those guidelines has never been fundamentally questioned. It's been adjusted, yes, updated with new research, made more nuanced in some ways, but the core assumption that food can be optimized through nutritional engineering, that eating can be reduced to following the right set of rules, that assumption remains intact. And this wasn't the only change.